the wildflower was blue. That was what Jessamy noticed first, before the fear arrived. A single stem of mountain columbine, fresh and vivid, resting inside the hollow of the ancient oak, where no flower had any right to be. She stood motionless in the gray dawn light, her fingers still curled around the lip of the hollow, and stared. The keepsake was still there. The tiny carved wolf she had whittled for Avon's second naming day, sat undisturbed on its bed of dried moss, exactly where she had placed it 3 years ago and every dawn since. But beside it, its stem bent gently to lean against the wooden figure, as though offering comfort, was the flower. Fresh, not a day old. Someone had been here. Jessamy's chest tightened until breathing became a deliberate act. Nobody came to Whisper Grove. The path was overgrown and treacherous, winding through root-choked earth and low branches that snagged hair and clothing. The grove sat at the far edge of the palace grounds, forgotten by everyone who had better things to tend. That was why she had chosen it. 3 years of walking this path at dawn, 3 years of pressing the little wolf into the hollow and whispering to a daughter who would never hear her, and not once had she encountered another soul. Until now. She pulled her hand back slowly, her gaze swept the base of the oak, and her stomach dropped. Paw prints, deep and heavy in the damp earth, far too large for a common wolf. An alpha had stood here recently. The prints circled the tree once, paused directly beneath the hollow where she kept the carving, and then disappeared into the undergrowth, heading east toward the palace. Jessamy crouched and pressed her fingers into one of the impressions. It was fresh enough that the edges hadn't crumbled. Whoever had come here had come in wolf form, in the dark, deliberately. They had found the hollow. They had seen the keepsake, and they had left a flower beside it. Her vision blurred, and she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. Nobody knew about this place. Nobody knew about Avon's wolf. Nobody in the capital even knew she had once been a mother, because she had buried that truth as carefully as she had buried her grief inside a tree, and she had done it for the same reason. Because the weight of it would crush her if she let anyone see. Avon, her girl, her sweet, wild girl, with her father's dark curls and her mother's wide brown eyes, 2 years old when the Grey March came. 2 years old when the fires swallowed Millhaven, and the screaming started, and Jessamy ran with Avon pressed against her chest, ran until the smoke was a black wall, and something hit her from behind, and the world went sideways. She had woken in a ditch with ash on her tongue and her arms empty, empty. The search lasted 9 days. The king's soldiers had driven the Greymark wolves back into the mountains by then, but the damage was done. 43 dead in Millhaven, 11 of them children. Avon's body was never recovered, but the soldiers told Jessamy what she already knew. No child that young could survive alone in the mountains. No child that young could have escaped the fires. Her daughter was gone, and no amount of searching would change that. So Jessamy stopped searching and started surviving, which was a different thing entirely. She walked to the capital with nothing but the clothes on her back and the carved wolf in her pocket, because it was the last thing her hands had made for her daughter, and throwing it away felt like a second death. Marin, the head healer at the palace infirmary, had taken her in without questions, given her work and a cot, and a purpose that kept her hands busy enough to survive the nights. The hollow tree she had found by accident, wandering the grounds in the sleepless dark of her first winter in Thornfeld. The ancient oak, with its split trunk and its deep hollow at chest height, just large enough to shelter a small carved wolf from the rain. She had placed it there on instinct, the way the devout placed offerings at shrines, and the ritual had taken root before she understood what she was doing. The grove was ancient, older than the palace by centuries, if the stories were true. Moss clung to every surface in thick green carpets, and the roots of the oaks broke through the earth like the spines of sleeping giants. In spring, bluebells covered the ground between the trees in a haze of pale violet, and the air smelled of wet earth and growing things. But it was not spring now, and the grove wore the bare, stripped look of late autumn, all brown leaves and exposed bark and the cold smell of coming frost. Jessamine knelt at the base of the oak and pressed her palm against the rough bark. This was the part of the ritual that hurt the most. The moment before she spoke, when the silence was still intact and she could almost pretend she wasn't alone. "Good morning, little wolf," she whispered. The words disappeared into the cold air. They always did. She said them anyway, every single morning. Because the alternative was admitting that no one would ever hear them. Every dawn she walked to the tree, placed the wolf inside, whispered her daughter's name, and then retrieved it before she left. The carving lived in her pocket during the day, and in the hollow during the hour of her grief. A tiny migration of sorrow that gave each morning a shape she could bear every dawn for 3 years. Jessamy walked to the hollow tree. She placed her palm over the tiny wolf, feeling the grain of the wood she had shaped with a borrowed knife in a life that felt like someone else's memory. She whispered Avon's name. And then she tucked the carving back into her pocket and went to the infirmary and pretended she was whole. But now someone had been here. Someone who walked on alpha paws in the dark and left wildflowers beside a dead child's toy. Jessamy took the carved wolf from the hollow and closed her fingers around it, feeling the familiar grooves and edges press into her palm. The flowers she left where it lay, unable to bring herself to touch it. Then she turned and walked back toward the infirmary, her mind churning with questions that had no answers. Marin was already at her workbench when Jessamy pushed through the door, grinding tincture roots with a steady, practiced rhythm. "You're white as bone," Marin said without looking up. "What happened?" Jessamy opened her mouth, then closed it. The instinct to protect her secret was so deeply embedded it overrode everything, even fear. Nothing. Bad sleep. Marin glanced up with the expression she reserved for obvious lies. But before she could press, the infirmary door swung open behind them. A palace guard stood in the corridor, his posture rigid, his face carefully neutral. "Miss Jessamy," he said, "you've been summoned to the upper wing. The Alpha King requires an herbalist for a private consultation." He paused. Immediately, Jessamy went cold all over. The walk to the upper wing took 7 minutes. Jessamy counted every second, because counting kept her breathing steady and breathing kept her upright, and staying upright kept her from running in the opposite direction. She had never been to the king's private wing. Herbalists didn't go to the king's private wing. Herbalists treated kitchen burns and guardsmen with infected blisters and the occasional noble with a hangover they didn't want the court physician to know about. They did not get summoned by name to attend the most powerful alpha in the realm. The guard led her through corridors she had only seen from a distance, past carved oak doors and tapestries older than her grandmother, and windows that looked out over the capital with the casual authority of a view that belonged to someone who owned everything it surveyed. The air up here was different, cleaner, colder. It smelled of aged wood and iron, and something beneath it all that Jessamy's wolf stirred at before she could name it. The guard stopped at a set of double doors, reinforced with iron bands, and knocked twice. "Enter," said a voice from inside. Low, clipped, controlled. The kind of voice that expected obedience the way gravity expected things to fall. The doors opened, and Jessamy stepped into the Alpha King's study. It was not what she had expected. No throne, no banners, no ceremonial excess. The room was spare and functional, dominated by a massive desk piled with correspondence and a long table covered in maps held down at the corners by smooth river stones. Weapons hung on the far wall, practical rather than decorative, and the narrow windows admitted only thin gray light that made the shadows deeper than they should have been. And behind the desk, a man who made the room feel small, simply by existing in it. King Torvald of Thornfeld was not merely large. He was the kind of large that rearranged the atmosphere, that made furniture seem insufficient and doorways seem narrow. Broad shoulders, dark hair cut short, a jaw that looked carved from the same stone as his castle walls. He was younger than she had imagined, though the lines around his eyes added years that didn't belong there. His gaze hit her the moment she crossed the threshold, and she felt it settle over her like a hand pressing down on her shoulders. He didn't greet her. He didn't smile. He watched her approach the way a hawk watches movement in the grass below, with absolute focus and no warmth whatsoever. "Your Majesty," Jessamy managed, and she was proud that her voice only trembled slightly. "I was told you required an herbalist." Standing beside the desk, arms folded, was a man she recognized from a distance. Fenwick, the king's beta. Lean, dark-eyed, with the watchful stillness of someone who noticed everything and said very little, he gave her a measured nod. "Miss Jessamy, thank you for coming." "His Majesty has been experiencing episodes of muscular rigidity," Fenwick said. "The court physicians have been unable to provide relief. We thought an herbalist's perspective might offer alternatives." Jessamy blinked. Muscular rigidity. That was why she was here. A medical consultation. The relief that flooded through her was so enormous she nearly laughed. Of course it was medical. What else could it possibly be? The Alpha King hadn't summoned a nobody herbalist to discuss wildflowers left in secret hollows. "Of course," she said, steadying herself. "May I examine him?" Torvald's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod. Jessamy approached the desk, on legs that felt borrowed from someone else. Up close, the wrongness was immediately apparent. His posture wasn't rigid because of authority or discipline. It was rigid because his muscles were locked. She could see the tension cording his neck, the way his shoulders were pulled up and back as though something was clenching them from the inside. His hands rested flat on the desk, but the tendons stood out like wires, every finger pressed down with the effort of keeping still. He was in pain, significant, sustained, carefully hidden pain. "May I touch your shoulder?" Jessamy asked. Another curt nod. She placed her hand on his left shoulder and felt the muscle beneath the fabric. Hard as iron spasm. Deep, sustained spasm. The kind that burned and ached and made every movement feel like grinding stone against stone. She pressed her thumb gently into the worst knot and heard his breath catch. And then something happened that she couldn't explain. The tension under her hand dissolved. Not gradually, not with the slow easing that came from skilled manipulation, but all at once, like a held breath released. The iron-hard muscle went soft. Torvald's shoulders dropped. His rigid spine curved slightly forward, as though a weight had been lifted from it, and the lines of strain bracketing his mouth smoothed away. Jessamy froze, her hand still on his shoulder. She hadn't done anything. She had barely begun to press, but the spasm was gone, and the king's breathing had changed from shallow and controlled to deep and slow and steady, as if his body had suddenly remembered how to exist without bracing. The silence in the room was absolute. Fenwick, who had been watching from beside the desk, went very still. Two advisors standing near the map table exchanged a glance that Jessamy couldn't interpret. Even the guard at the door shifted his weight. Torvald opened his eyes, and for one unguarded second his expression was raw, confused, almost frightened. Then the mask dropped back into place, and he straightened, pulling away from her touch with a sharpness that stung. "That will be all," he said. Jessamy stepped back, her hand still warm from his shoulder, her mind racing. "Your Majesty, if you'd like, I can prepare a poultice for the residual inflammation, some willow bark, and that will be all," Torvald repeated. His voice was flat. His gaze was fixed on the desk in front of him, and he did not look at her again. Fenwick appeared at her side and guided her toward the door, with a hand that was polite but left no room for argument. In the corridor, after the doors had closed behind them, Jessamy turned to the beta and found him staring at her with an expression she could not read. "What did you do?" Fenwick asked. "Nothing," Jessamy said, bewildered. "I touched his shoulder, and the spasm released. That happens sometimes with deep tissue work, but not usually that quickly. I didn't even apply real pressure." "The king has not experienced relief from those episodes in over a year," Fenwick said quietly. His voice was careful, measured, as though each word was being weighed before release. "Every healer, every physician, every remedy in this kingdom has failed to ease them, and you touched him once, and it stopped." Jessamy stared at him. The corridor felt very long and very empty. "Maybe it was coincidence," she offered. "A natural release cycle that happened to coincide." "Perhaps," Fenwick said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe that for a moment. "Stay in the palace today. Don't leave the grounds. I'll send for you before evening." "Why?" Jessamy asked, and hated the way her voice climbed. Fenwick looked at her for a long moment. Something in his dark eyes shifted, a calculation, a decision. "Because His Majesty's condition is not muscular rigidity," he said quietly. "It is far worse than that, and what happened in that room is the first hopeful thing I have seen in 3 years." He turned and walked back toward the king's doors, leaving Jessamy alone in the cold corridor, with a racing pulse and the growing, sickening certainty that she had just stumbled into something she did not understand and could not walk away from. The second encounter happened that same evening. Fenwick came for her at dusk, appearing in the infirmary doorway without announcement, his face composed into the careful neutrality that Jessamy was beginning to understand meant something significant was being concealed. "Would you be willing to sit with the king during a private meeting?" he asked. "An observation, if you will." Jessamy looked up from the tincture she was bottling, her hands suddenly unsteady. "Sit with him? Doing what?" "Nothing," Fenwick replied. "Simply being present in the room." The walk to the king's study was worse the second time because now she knew what to expect, and the anticipation was its own particular torture. Fenwick opened the door and gestured to a chair positioned against the far wall, well away from the desk. "Here," he said quietly. "Just sit." Jessamy sat. The wood creaked beneath her weight. King Torvald was at his desk, head bent over a stack of correspondence, and he did not acknowledge her presence. He didn't glance up when she entered, didn't react when the chair groaned, didn't so much as shift his attention from the document in front of him. Jessamy pressed her hands together in her lap and tried to make herself as small as possible. 2 advisors entered. A low conversation about border fortifications began. The king asked clipped questions and made notes. In tight, controlled handwriting, the fire crackled, the clock on the mantel ticked. Jessamy watched and waited, and tried to understand why she was here. 7 minutes passed. She noticed it first in his hands. The tendons that had been standing out like cables that morning gradually softened. His grip on the pen loosened from a white-knuckled clamp to something resembling a normal hold. Jessamy watched, fascinated and uneasy, as the change spread upward through his body. The rigid brace of his shoulders eased. The locked muscles in his neck released their stranglehold one by one, and his head settled into a more natural position. His breathing, which had been shallow and carefully regulated since she walked in, deepened. 20 minutes. Torvald's pen slowed. He stared at the page in front of him, his eyelids heavy, and for a moment Jessamy thought he might fall asleep right there at his desk. Then he blinked, hard, and forced himself upright. But she could see the difference. The pain lines around his eyes had softened. The granite set of his jaw had loosened. Just enough to look human, he looked, for the first time since she had seen him, like a man instead of a monument. Then his gaze lifted and found her across the room. The impact of those gray eyes meeting hers knocked the air from Jessamy's lungs. There was no hostility in them, no suspicion, but there was something far more unsettling. Not the kind that came from seeing a face before, but something deeper, something that lived beneath thought and operated on instinct. His wolf was looking at her through those eyes, and whatever it saw made the king's expression fracture for one raw, unguarded heartbeat before he looked away. The meeting ended. The advisors left. Jessamy sat rigid in her chair, her pulse hammering, unable to move, until Fenwick appeared beside her. "You can go," he said. She stood on unsteady legs and made it all the way to the infirmary corridor before Fenwick caught up. "It happened again," she said, turning to face him. "The same thing as this morning. I didn't touch him. I didn't even go near him. And it still happened. His entire body changed." 23 minutes, Fenwick confirmed, his voice low. "The longest sustained relief he has experienced since the episodes began." "What are the episodes?" Jessamy demanded. The question had been building since morning, pressing against her ribs like something with claws. "You said it wasn't muscular rigidity? What is it?" Fenwick was quiet for a long moment. The corridor was empty, their words bouncing softly off the stone walls. "Come with me," he said. He led her not back to the infirmary, but to a small anteroom off the main corridor, windowless and private. He shut the door and stood with his back against it, studying her with an expression that balanced urgency against caution. "What I am about to tell you does not leave this room," Fenwick said. "If it becomes public knowledge, the consequences for the king and for this kingdom will be catastrophic." Jessamy's stomach dropped. "I understand." "The king is losing his wolf." The words landed like a closed fist. Jessamy stared at him, trying to process. An alpha losing his wolf. That wasn't an illness. That was a death sentence. 3 years ago, during the Greymark campaign, something happened, Fenwick continued, each word measured and deliberate. "After the final battle, after the rogue Alpha Garrick was killed and his forces were broken, the king returned from that war changed. At first it was subtle, difficulty shifting, a delay between intention and transformation that hadn't existed before. Then the delays grew longer, the pain started. His wolf is trapped inside him, fighting to surface, and failing. Every episode you witnessed, the rigidity, the spasms, that is, his wolf trying to break through, and his body refusing to allow it." Jessamy pressed her hand against her mouth. A shifter whose wolf could not emerge. It was the most terrible thing she could imagine. Like drowning on dry land, like suffocating in open air. The wolf was not a separate entity. It was the other half of a shifter's soul. To be cut off from it was to be cut in half and expected to keep living. "If his wolf dies inside him," Jessamy whispered, "he dies too." "Yes," Fenwick said simply, "and the deterioration is accelerating. 6 months ago the episodes came once a week. Now they come daily, sometimes twice. Every healer, every mystic, every remedy in the kingdom has been tried. Nothing works." He paused, and something shifted in his dark eyes. "Until this morning. Until you touched his shoulder and his wolf went quiet, for the first time in 3 years. The enormity of it pressed down on Jessamy like deep water. "You think I can help him." "I think you are the only person who has helped him," Fenwick corrected. Jessamy's legs felt hollow. She leaned against the wall, kneading the cold stone at her back. "So the consultation this morning was a test. You brought me back this evening to confirm it." "Yes. And now you want me to keep doing it." Fenwick held her gaze. "The king is requesting your presence in his private chambers this evening and every evening after that. Until we understand why you are the only thing keeping his wolf alive." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Jessamy's feet. His private chambers, every evening. The most dangerous alpha in existence. And she was being asked to sit beside him in the dark while something inside him fought to break free. She thought of the carved wolf in her pocket, of the blue wildflower someone had left beside it, of the alpha-sized paw prints circling her grief tree. Then, another thought surfaced, slower and colder, and it wrapped around her ribs like a fist. 3 years ago, the Greymark campaign. King Torvald had led that war. His soldiers had marched through the borderlands, had burned the rogue settlements, had driven the Greymark wolves into the mountains. And in the chaos between those two colliding forces, a village called Millhaven had been swallowed whole. 43 dead, 11 of them children. One of them hers. Jessamy looked at Fenwick, and something in her expression must have changed, because the beta's careful composure flickered. "I'll be there," Jessamy said, her voice steady, despite the storm inside her. "But I need you to understand something. The last time I stood near the King's War, it took everything I had." Fenwick opened his mouth, then closed it. He studied her for a long-waited moment. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm sorry." He left before she could ask him what exactly he was apologizing for. The king's chambers were larger than the study, and infinitely more intimidating. Not because of their grandeur, though they were grand in the sparse, unadorned way that everything belonging to Torvald seemed to be, but because of the bed. It dominated the far wall, enormous and unavoidable, and the sight of it made Jessamy's stomach fold in on itself. "You'll sit here," Fenwick said, gesturing to a wooden chair, positioned near the hearth, a safe distance from everything that mattered. "The fire will be maintained throughout the night. You may read, rest, or sleep as you wish. His Majesty will retire when he's ready." "And I just sit here," Jessamy repeated. "You just sit here." She sat. The fire crackled. The chair was hard and unforgiving, and she folded her hands in her lap and stared at the flames and tried not to think about the fact that she was about to spend the night in the Alpha King's bedroom. The Alpha King whose war had swallowed her village, whose soldiers had searched the rubble and found 43 bodies, and told the survivors to be grateful it wasn't worse. Torvald arrived 20 minutes later, entering without ceremony or acknowledgement. He moved to the desk in the corner and began reading through a stack of documents, his back to her, his posture a wall of deliberate indifference. Jessamy watched the line of his shoulders and saw the tension already living there, the slow creep of rigidity climbing his spine like frost spreading across glass. An hour passed, neither of them spoke. The fire burned lower. Jessamy's eyelids grew heavy, and she fought to keep them open because falling asleep on the first night felt like failing a test she hadn't studied for. The silence was enormous. It filled the room like something solid, pressing against her ears, and she found herself listening to his breathing, shallow, controlled, the breath of a man whose body was constantly braced against something. Then, so gradually she almost missed it, the breathing changed, deeper, slower, the pen in his hand stopped moving, and his rigid shoulders descended by inches, like a drawbridge lowering. Jessamy held perfectly still, afraid that any movement would break whatever fragile thing was happening. His head dipped. His hand went slack against the desk. And then he was asleep, slumped forward over his documents, with his cheek resting on his forearm, and his breathing deep and even and utterly unguarded. She watched him for a long time, this man who terrified everyone, who had ended a war through force and tactical brilliance, who carried a kingdom on shoulders that couldn't stop seizing. In sleep, the severity left his face. The hard jaw softened, the permanent furrow between his brows smoothed into something younger and sadder than she had expected. Something knotted behind her sternum, and she couldn't decide if it was pity or anger or something less comfortable than either. He slept for 2 hours. Jessamy knew because she counted every minute sitting in her hard chair by the dying fire, watching the shadows move across his face, and wondering how a man who had commanded the destruction of Millhaven could look so broken in the dark. She tried to hold on to her resentment. It was all she had, the only armor between her and the dangerous softness that threatened to creep in whenever she watched the severity drain from his face. But resentment required energy, and the quiet warmth of the firelit room and the sound of his steady breathing were conspiring against her resolve. When she left before dawn, she passed a corridor she hadn't noticed the night before. A narrow passage branching off from the main hall, dimly lit, with a single guard stationed at a heavy wooden door. The guard's eyes followed her as she passed, and from behind the door, faint and almost imagined, she heard a sound, small, soft, like the whimper of something very young. Jessamy's feet stopped moving. Her lungs forgot their rhythm. The guard met her eyes, his face blank and practiced. "Wrong corridor, miss," he said. She walked on, but her hands were trembling, and the sound stayed with her long after she had left the upper wing behind. It lived in the space behind her ribs, where Oven's absence was sharpest, and it made her feel slightly sick, for reasons she couldn't name. She told herself it was a cat, or a bird trapped somewhere in the walls, or the wind finding a gap in the old stone. She told herself 100 reasonable things, and none of them stuck because the sound had been too deliberate, too alive, too small. And her wolf, which had been quiet her entire life, had surged at the sound with a ferocity that left her breathless. A pattern formed over the following nights. Jessamy arrived at dusk. Torvald ignored her. He worked at his desk, read his reports, made his notes in the margins, and pretended she did not exist. And every night, without fail, the tension drained from his body within the hour and sleep found him. She learned to read the progression. First, the hands would soften, then the shoulders. Then the rigid column of his spine would curve into something human, and his breathing would deepen, and the pen would slow, and finally his head would dip, and the King of Thornfeld would surrender to sleep at his own desk, like a student who'd studied too long. On the third night, she noticed the way his jaw unclenched in sleep, the way the hard line of his mouth relaxed into something almost vulnerable. She caught herself staring and looked away so quickly she nearly gave herself whiplash. On the fourth night, a cushion appeared on her chair, thick, embroidered, absurdly comfortable compared to the bare wood she had been enduring. Jessamy looked at it, then looked at Torvald, who was reading with the rigid concentration of a man determined not to be caught in an act of kindness. "Thank you for the cushion," she said.
I don't know what you're referring to.
He replied, without looking up. "The one on my chair, the one that wasn't here yesterday." A pause, the faintest shift in his jaw. "The servants must have placed it." "It matches your bedding," Jessamy observed. His ears went pink. Jessamy bit her tongue and said nothing more, but something warm bloomed behind her ribs that had no business being there. She told herself it was gratitude, nothing more, and almost believed it. On the fifth night, she passed the locked door again on her way out. This time there was no sound, but the guard stiffened when he saw her, and his hand moved to the pommel of his sword. The message was clear: don't linger. On the sixth night, the silence became too heavy, and Jessamy started talking. Not about anything important. She told him about a patient who had come to the infirmary, claiming his rash was a curse from a vengeful former sweetheart, when it was obviously a reaction to unwashed bedsheets. She told him about the time Marin had accidentally created a poultice so potent it stripped the varnish off a wooden table. She talked about the apprentice who confused yarrow and valerian root and spent an entire afternoon wondering why his burn patients kept falling asleep. She talked because the silence made her think, and thinking led to places she couldn't afford to go. Places like the locked door in the corridor and the sound behind it that she had convinced herself was nothing. Places like Millhaven and Ash and Empty Arms. So she talked about herb lore and funny patients, and the time a guardsman had tried to cure his own toothache by pressing raw garlic against the gum, and had burned a hole in his cheek instead. She talked about the way lavender could calm a racing heart if brewed properly, and how chamomile flowers had to be picked before noon, or they lost half their potency. She talked until her throat was dry, and her voice had gone hoarse, and the fire had burned down to embers. She didn't know when his pen stopped scratching. She didn't know when he turned in his chair to face her, his gray eyes watching her in the firelight with an expression she couldn't decode. She only knew that when she finally ran out of words and looked up, he was staring at her like she was something impossible. "The patient with the rash," Torvald said. "Did you tell him it was his sheets?" Jessamy blinked. He'd been listening the entire time. "I did," she said. "He didn't believe me." Came back 3 days later with the same rash and a new theory about his former sweetheart being a witch. The corner of Torvald's mouth moved. Not a smile, not quite, but the closest thing to one she had ever seen on his face. And Jessamy's treacherous heart did something it absolutely should not have done. It leaped. She lay awake that night on her cushioned chair, staring at the ceiling, listening to him breathe, and thought about how dangerous it was to want the almost smile of a man whose war had taken everything from her. She thought about it for a long time, and then she thought about the way his face looked in sleep, and the cushion he pretended he hadn't placed, and the way he'd remembered the patient with the rash 3 days after she'd told the story. She thought about it until the fire died, and the room went dark, and the only sound was his breathing and the quiet, treacherous drumming of her own heart. Marin delivered the verdict on a cold morning, 12 days into the arrangement, her voice clinical and her eyes sharp. "The proximity is working, but only partially. His wolf stabilizes while you're in the room, but the effect fades within hours of your departure. The deterioration resumes each time you leave his presence." She paused, folding her arms. "Physical contact would deepen the stabilization." Sustained contact. Direct skin. Jessamy stared at her. "You want me to touch him?" "I want you to hold his hand," Marin corrected mildly. "It's hardly scandalous. He's the king." "He's a patient," Marin replied. "And he's dying." One of those facts should carry more weight than the other. That evening Jessamy sat in her cushioned chair by the fire and tried to find the words. Torvald was at his desk, working through a report on grain taxation, and the scratching of his pen against parchment was the only sound in the room. "Marin believes physical contact would improve the treatment," Jessamy said, and each word felt like pushing a boulder uphill. The pen stopped. Torvald's shoulders went rigid, though whether from his condition or from the suggestion, she couldn't tell. "Define physical contact," he said without turning around. "Holding hands, sitting close, nothing beyond that." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Jessamy to consider the possibility that she might spontaneously combust from embarrassment. Then Torvald pushed back from the desk and stood. He crossed the room with 3 long strides and sat in the chair beside hers, the one that hadn't been there yesterday and had clearly been placed by the servants, who apparently anticipated everything. He held out his hand. Jessamy looked at it. Large, calloused, steady, despite everything his body was enduring. She placed her hand in his. The contact was immediate and overwhelming. Not pain, not shock, but a rush of warmth that started at her fingertips and flooded up her arm and into her chest and settled there like a second heartbeat. Her wolf, quiet and docile her entire life, surged forward with a force that made her gasp. Torvald's eyes widened. His fingers tightened around hers, reflexive and fierce, and she felt something pass between them, through the point of contact, something old and instinctive, and far bigger than either of them. His wolf. She could feel it, trapped and struggling beneath layers of whatever was killing him. But when her skin touched his, the struggling eased. The wolf settled, and something in Torvald's face changed so profoundly that Jessamy had to look away, because the raw relief in his eyes was too private, too exposed, too much. They sat like that for an hour, hand in hand by the fire, saying nothing. His thumb traced an absent pattern across her knuckles, and Jessamy doubted he knew he was doing it. The warmth of his palm radiated up her arm and into her shoulder and down through her entire body, and she could feel his wolf through the contact, not struggling anymore, but resting, settling, pressing toward her, touch the way a wounded animal presses toward warmth. When he finally fell asleep in his chair, his fingers still wrapped around hers, Jessamy looked down at their joined hands and felt the first cold flicker of something she recognized as fear. Because this wasn't just proximity. This wasn't pheromones and herbal residue and whatever clinical explanation Marin had constructed. This was a bond. She could feel it forming, delicate and insistent, weaving itself between them with every minute of contact. And bonds didn't form between strangers. Bonds formed between mates. No. Jessamy shut the thought down with a violence that startled her. She was not this man's mate. She was a foundling herbalist, with no family, and no name and no rank. She was a tool, a remedy, a warm body in a chair, whose only value was the inexplicable effect she had on a dying king. That was all. That was all she could afford for it to be. But her wolf disagreed, pressing forward with an insistence that bordered on desperation, and Jessamy spent the rest of the night fighting a war inside herself that she was not at all certain she could win. In the morning, she went to the hollow tree. The second flower was there. Blue mountain columbine identical to the first, resting on the bed of dried moss inside the hollow, where the carved wolf usually sat during her dawn visits. Vivid, placed with the same careful tenderness as the first, its stem bent gently against the moss, as though whoever left it had taken time to position it just so. Jessamy's knees buckled, and she caught herself against the trunk. Twice now. Whoever was doing this had come back, had climbed through the overgrown grove in the dark, had found the hollow, had left a flower in the place where she kept her grief with a gentleness that made her eyes burn. Why? Who would do this? Who would care enough about a nobody's sorrow to make this kind of pilgrimage? She looked at the paw prints in the mud, alpha-sized, the same as before. Then she looked toward the palace and felt the questions multiplying inside her like fever. Who in the palace knew about her tree? Who would make this journey in the dark, in wolf form, to leave a flower beside a keepsake they couldn't possibly understand? Unless they did understand. Unless they knew exactly what the carved wolf meant and who it was for. The day passed in a haze. Jessamy worked through her patients on instinct, her hands competent, but her mind 1,000 miles away. She found herself watching the palace corridors differently, now studying every alpha she passed and wondering if they had mud on their boots, if they smelled of Whisper Grove, if they knew what Blue Mountain Columbine meant to a woman who had lost everything. That evening, in the king's chambers, she sat beside Torvald and took his hand as had become their ritual. He was quiet tonight. The lines around his eyes deeper than usual, the pain clearly worse. She found herself talking again to fill the silence, telling him about a merchant's wife who had insisted that lavender oil could cure deafness and had poured so much of it into her husband's ear that he developed a raging infection on top of his existing hearing loss. Torvald didn't laugh, but his breathing changed in a way that suggested he wanted to. His hand was warm around hers, and the tension in his body was easing with a speed that still startled her. The carved wolf was in her other hand, tucked against her palm, a comfort she reached for without thinking. A habit formed over 3 years of pocketing the small figure every morning and holding it during her hardest hours. But tonight, her grip shifted and the tiny carving slipped, tumbling from her fingers onto the rug between their chairs. Torvald looked down, his gaze found the wooden wolf on the floor, and he flinched. It was small, barely a movement at all, but Jessamy had spent enough nights studying this man to know the difference between his controlled stillness and genuine reaction. His face went pale, his jaw locked. His hand in hers tightened with a sharpness that bordered on pain, and something moved behind his eyes that looked unmistakably like guilt. "What is that?" he asked, his voice very quiet. "A keepsake," Jessamy said, watching him carefully. "I carved it for someone I lost." She waited for the follow-up question. It didn't come. Torvald released her hand, bent down, and picked up the wooden wolf with fingers that were not quite steady. He held it in his palm, staring at it, and the expression on his face was one of such concentrated anguish that Jessamy's breath caught. He knew what it was. She could see it in the way he held it, in the careful reverence of his grip, in the way his thumb traced the rough carved ears as though he had touched something exactly like it before. He knew, and the knowing was breaking something inside him, that he had spent considerable effort keeping whole. His mouth opened. For one suspended moment, Jessamy thought he was going to tell her something. Something enormous. She could see it building behind his eyes, pressing against the walls of his composure, fighting to break through. But then his jaw clenched, and the moment passed, and whatever truth had been gathering behind his teeth was swallowed back down into the dark. He placed the carving back in her hand, with a gentleness that felt like an apology, and turned away. "We should sleep," he said. His voice was rough. Jessamy closed her fingers around the carving, and felt the questions burning through her like fever. But the wall had gone back up, impenetrable and absolute, and the king did not speak again that night. 17 days into the arrangement, the worst episode yet struck without warning. Jessamy was sitting beside Torvald in his study during a late meeting with 2 border commanders when it happened. One moment he was speaking, his voice low and steady, issuing orders about patrol rotations along the northern ridge. The next, his entire body went rigid, his hands slammed flat against the desk. His back arched and every muscle in his frame locked simultaneously, with a force that drove the air from his lungs in a strangled gasp. The commanders lurched to their feet. Fenwick was at the king's side in 2 strides, his hands on Torvald's shoulders, his voice sharp. "Your Majesty! Focus, breathe." But Torvald couldn't breathe. Jessamy could see it. His chest was locked, his ribs clamped shut, and his wolf was surging against its prison with a violence that was tearing him apart from the inside. His eyes rolled back. A sound ripped from his throat that was neither human nor animal but something agonized and between. Something that made every instinct in Jessamy's body scream. She moved without thinking. She shoved past Fenwick, grabbed Torvald's face between her hands and pressed her forehead against his. "Come back," she said. "Come back to me." The contact was like being plunged into ice water. The world went white, then dark, and suddenly she was somewhere else. Cold, suffocating silence. A forest of skeletal trees stretching in every direction, their branches bare and reaching like fingers grasping at nothing. Fog pressed in from all sides, thick and gray and alive with a malice that had texture and weight. The air tasted of ash. Jessamy spun. Torvald, he was there, 20 feet ahead, on his knees in the gray mist, but he wasn't alone. His wolf was beside him, visible and separate and wrong. The massive silver beast crouched in the fog, its legs chained to the ground by dark, vine-like tendrils that pulsed with a sickly green light. The wolf was pulling against them, snarling, thrashing, but every movement only drove the tendrils deeper into its flesh. "Oh gods," Jessamy whispered. This was what was killing him. Not an illness, not deterioration. A cage. Something had built a cage around his wolf, and was slowly, deliberately strangling it. She ran toward him, her bare feet soundless on the fog-soft ground. The tendrils pulsed with their sickly light, and where they touched the wolf's body, the silver fur had gone gray and brittle, like metal left too long in acid. The beast was enormous, even diminished, and the power still coiled in its frame spoke of what it had been before the cage began its slow strangulation. "Torvald, look at me. We need to leave. We need to get out of here." He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the wolf, on the tendrils tightening around its throat, and the expression on his face was one of helpless, wrecked surrender. Like he had watched this happen 1,000 times and stopped believing it could end differently. Jessamy grabbed his arm. The moment she touched him, a shock of images exploded through her mind. each one vivid and razor-edged. Fire. A village, burning, screaming. Torvald in wolf form, massive and silver, tearing through a wall of flame. Soldiers clashing in the smoke. And then, through the chaos, a sound. A child crying. She saw him turn, saw him follow the sound through the burning ruins, saw him find the collapsed doorway of a house that was minutes from being swallowed completely. And inside, beneath a fallen beam, small and screaming and covered in soot, a child. A girl, dark curls, wide brown eyes. A tiny carved wolf clutched in one fist, the twin of the one Jessamy carried in her pocket, the one she had made with her own hands for a naming day that felt like a lifetime ago. Torvald shifted to human form, heaved the beam aside with a roar of effort, and pulled the child free. She was burned, terrified, and clinging to his neck, with tiny fists that wouldn't let go. He carried her through the fire, shielding her body with his own, and emerged from the ruins with his skin blistered and the girl still screaming against his chest. Then another figure appeared in the smoke. An old woman, bone-thin, with white eyes that saw nothing and everything. At once she raised a hand toward the king and the child and spoke words that crackled in the air like burning paper. The curse hit them both. Jessamy felt it through the vision, a flash of cold, so absolute it burned. And then the image fractured into 1,000 pieces and scattered. The vision shattered. For a moment, Jessamy hung in the space between the vision and reality, suspended in a darkness that tasted of grief and old magic. She could still feel the heat of the fire on her skin. She could still hear the child screaming. She could still see the white-eyed woman's hand raised against the sky, and the words of the curse hanging in the smoke like something alive and hungry. Jessamy wrenched free of Torvald's arm and stumbled backward, gasping. They were back in the study. The fire was crackling. Fenwick was gripping her shoulder, shaking her, calling her name. The commanders were pressed against the far wall, pale-faced. And Torvald was unconscious in his chair, his breathing deep and steady, the episode broken. But Jessamy couldn't breathe. Her heart was hammering so violently she could feel it in her fingertips, and the images were still burning behind her eyes. A child, dark curls, brown eyes, a tiny carved wolf in a tiny fist. A little girl pulled from burning ruins 3 years ago. 3 years ago. During the Greymark. In a village called Millhaven. Jessamy, Fenwick said sharply. Look at me. What happened? She turned to the beta and saw that her horror must have been written across her face because his expression shifted, something careful and guarded, slamming into place behind his eyes. The child, Jessamy whispered, in the fire. He found a child. Fenwick went very still. Who was she? Jessamy asked, and her voice was climbing, cracking, breaking apart. The child he carried from the fire. The girl with the dark curls and the brown eyes, and the carved wolf in her hand. Who was she? Jessamy, you need to calm down, Fenwick said quietly. Who was she? Jessamy's voice was a ragged shout now, echoing off the stone walls, and she didn't care. She could see it. She could see Avon's face, Avon's curls, Avon's terrified brown eyes reflected in the firelight. The carved wolf, in the vision, was the twin of the one in her pocket, but that was impossible. Avon was dead. Avon had been dead for 3 years, unless she wasn't. The thought detonated inside her, and her vision tunneled to a single bright point. Her wolf surged forward with a howl that resonated through her bones, a sound of recognition and fury and desperate clawing need that nearly split her in two. You need to leave, Torvald said. His voice came from behind her, rough with sleep and something deeper. She spun. He was awake, sitting upright in his chair, and the look on his face was one of absolute ruin. You saw, he said, not a question. I saw a child, Jessamy whispered, tears streaming down her face. I saw you carry a child from the fire, a girl with dark hair and brown eyes, who was holding a carved wolf that I made with my own hands. My daughter's hair. My daughter's eyes. My daughter's keepsake. Torvald closed his eyes. His hands gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white. And the silence that followed was the worst sound Jessamy had ever heard. "Please," she begged. "Please tell me the truth." He opened his eyes. They were wet. "You need to leave," he said again. "For your safety. For hers. You need to leave these chambers and not come back." Jessamy felt the words like a blade between her ribs. She staggered backward. "Hers?" She repeated the word, ripping itself from her throat. "You said hers. She's alive. My daughter is alive. Go," Torvald said. "That's an order." The roar that followed shook the walls, and Jessamy ran. She ran through the corridors with tears blinding her. Past the locked door where she had heard the small sound. Past the guard who wouldn't meet her eyes. Down through the darkened palace and out into the cold night air. She ran until her legs gave out at the edge of Whisper Grove, and she collapsed at the base of the hollow tree, with her hands clawing at the bark and sobs tearing from her chest. Inside the hollow, resting on the bed of moss, where she placed the carved wolf each morning, a third blue wildflower waited. And beside the tree, pressed deep into the mud beside the alpha-sized paw prints she already knew, was a second set of tracks, boot prints, large and heavy and human. The prints of a man who came here in both forms, who visited a grieving mother's shrine in the dark, who left flowers where a keepsake once rested because he recognized what it meant, because he had seen the matching carving before. Because he knew whose it was, because the child who had clutched that matching wolf in her tiny fist when he pulled her from the fire was not dead at all. Jessamy pressed her forehead against the ancient bark and screamed. She screamed until her voice gave out and the grove swallowed the sound and the cold night air burned in her raw throat. Then she curled around the base of the tree, with the carved wolf pressed against her heart, and wept for everything she had lost, and everything she might be about to find. 3 days passed. 3 days of silence from the upper wing. 3 days of Jessamy lying on her narrow cot in the infirmary, staring at the ceiling, her body slowly coming apart. The symptoms arrived within hours of her exile and worsened with terrifying speed. Her hands shook constantly. Her vision blurred at the edges, gray, creeping in like fog. The migraine started on the second morning and didn't stop. She worked through them with the curtains drawn, grinding herbs by touch, because the light was a needle behind her eyes, and told herself it was exhaustion, stress, the aftermath of what she had seen. But her wolf knew better. Her wolf was howling, a constant, keening pressure beneath her skin that wouldn't ease, no matter what she did. It wanted him. It wanted to be near him with a ferocity that bordered on madness. And every hour of distance drove the need deeper until it was indistinguishable from pain. On the third morning, Jessamy couldn't stand. She tried, gripping the edge of the workbench, and her legs folded beneath her. She hit the stone floor hard and lay there breathing through the wave of dizziness, and thought about how absurd it was that she had survived losing a child and 3 years of grief, only to be brought down by the absence of a man she had known for less than a month. Marin found her on the floor. The head healer's face went tight with a worry she didn't bother to hide. "This has gone far enough," Marin said, helping her onto a chair. "Tell me what happened in his chambers." Jessamy told her all of it. The vision, the fire, the child with Avon's face, the king's wrecked expression, his order to leave. She told Marin about the hollow tree and the flowers and the carved wolf. Told her about having been a mother, about Millhaven, about Avon. She had never spoken these things aloud to anyone in the capital, and the confession tore through her like a river breaking a dam. And when she was done, she added the thing she had been holding back since the very first night. The thing that terrified her more than all the rest. "I can feel him," she whispered, Through the walls, through the distance, I can feel his wolf dying. Marin, and it's pulling me down with it. Marin was quiet for a long time. She sat across from Jessamy with her hands folded and her gaze turned inward, the expression of a healer assembling pieces of a puzzle that had finally revealed its shape. The bond between you is not incidental, Marin said at last. It's not pheromones and herbal residue. Those were symptoms, not causes. Your wolf recognized his from the first moment of contact. What you're experiencing is a mate bond, incomplete, unacknowledged, but real. Jessamy shook her head. But the denial was mechanical. She already knew. She had known since the first time their hands touched, and her wolf surged forward like it had found something it had been searching for all her life. There's more, Marin continued, her voice careful. The king's condition, the cage around his wolf, that's a curse. Old magic, dark magic, cast during the Greymark by someone with enough hatred to make it stick. And curses like that need fuel. They feed on something. Guilt, grief. The emotions the cursed person can't release. Jessamy's breath hitched, his guilt over the war. Yes, and possibly something else. His guilt over a child he saved but could not heal. A child he has been hiding. A child whose mother he has watched grieve for 3 years, knowing the truth and unable to speak it. The words landed like stones, in still water, each one sending ripples through everything Jessamy thought she understood. Why? Jessamy asked, and her voice broke on the word. Why couldn't he tell me? Marin hesitated. I can only guess. But if the child was cursed too, if Vedmara's magic touched the girl as well as the king, then telling you might have made things worse. Curses built on grief grow stronger when the grief intensifies. Imagine learning your daughter was alive, but trapped, suffering, unreachable. Your anguish would have fed the very spell keeping her imprisoned. The logic was horrible and perfect, and it made Jessamy want to scream. He had carried this alone. For 3 years he had carried the weight of a truth that would have destroyed her to hear, and destroyed her daughter if spoken. And he had done it in silence, visiting the hollow tree in the dark to leave flowers beside a keepsake he recognized, because it was the only atonement available to a man trapped between mercy and cruelty. I need to see him, Jessamy said, rising on unsteady legs. I need to go back. He ordered you away. I don't care. Marin studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Go. But Jessamy, whatever you find in there, whatever he tells you, remember that a curse fed by grief can only be broken by its opposite. And the opposite of grief is not joy. It's acceptance. Jessamy walked to the upper wing on legs that trembled with every step. The corridors were quiet, the palace deep in its evening stillness. She passed the locked door, and this time the guard didn't speak. He looked at her with something that might have been sympathy and stood aside. But Jessamy didn't stop at the locked door. Not yet. She went to the king's chambers and pushed the doors open without knocking. Torvald was standing by the window, his silhouette dark against the last light of dusk. He turned when the doors opened, and the sight of him nearly drove Jessamy to her knees. He looked worse than she had ever seen him. The hollows beneath his eyes were caverns. His skin had a grayish cast, and the rigid tension in his body wasn't his wolf fighting to surface anymore. It was the tension of a man whose body was failing, whose foundation was crumbling, who was holding himself together through nothing but stubborn, furious will. I told you to stay away, he said. His voice was rough and raw, scraped down to something barely functional. And I'm telling you no, Jessamy replied, stepping inside and closing the doors behind her. I'm done being sent away. I'm done being protected from truths. I have a right to know. His jaw clenched. You don't understand what you're asking for. Then explain it to me. She crossed the room until she stood directly in front of him, close enough to feel the heat of him, close enough to see the way his eyes tracked her face with a hunger he couldn't fully conceal. Tell me about the child you pulled from the fire in Millhaven. Tell me about the curse. Tell me why you visit a hollow tree in the dark and leave flowers beside my daughter's keepsake." The sound that escaped Torvald's throat was wrecked. He turned away from her, pressing his fists against the window frame, his shoulders shaking. "Her name is Avon," he said. "She was trapped under a beam in a burning house. I carried her out, and Vedmara, Garrick's mother, cursed us both. The girl and the king who killed her son, two halves of the same spell." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Your daughter is alive, Jessamy. She's here, in this palace, behind a locked door, 40 paces from where you slept every night. And I have spent 3 years trying to break the curse that's keeping her trapped between her wolf and her human form, and I have failed, every single time." Jessamy's knees gave out. She sank to the floor, her hand over her mouth, and a sob that tore through her was a sound she didn't recognize as her own. Alive. Avon was alive. Her girl was alive, and had been here, right here, close enough to touch, for 3 years. "Why didn't you tell me?" The words were barely audible through her tears. Torvald turned to face her. His cheeks were wet. "Because the curse feeds on grief," he said. "And telling a mother that her child is alive but unreachable, trapped in a form she can't hold or comfort or speak to, would have created a grief so profound it would have made the curse unbreakable." He sank to his knees in front of her, his hands hovering at her shoulders, wanting to touch her and afraid to. "I tried to find another way. Every mystic, every scholar, every healer in the kingdom. I sold crown lands to fund the search. I visited your tree because it was the only place I could tell her I was sorry without making things worse." Jessamy looked at him through her tears, at this man who had carried an impossible burden in silence and called it duty, and she felt the bond between them ignite with a force that burned through every wall she had left. She took his face between her hands. "Let me help you save her," she said. "Let me help you save both of you." That night, for the first time, Jessamy chose to sleep beside the Alpha King, with full knowledge of what lay between them. There was no pretense of clinical distance, no chair by the fire, no careful gap between their bodies. Jessamy lay beside Torvald, in the enormous bed, and laced her fingers through his. He held on, like she was the only solid thing in a dissolving world, and within minutes, his breathing evened and his body surrendered to a sleep so deep it seemed to swallow him whole. Jessamy didn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to his heartbeat, feeling the bond pulse warm and steady between them, and she thought about what Marin had told her. A curse, fed by grief, can only be broken by its opposite. And the opposite of grief is not joy, it's acceptance. She thought about Avon behind the locked door, 40 paces away, trapped in a form that couldn't call for her mother. She thought about the carved wolf in her pocket, and the matching one that Avon had been holding when Torvald pulled her from the fire. She thought about 3 years of whispering to a hollow tree, and a man who left flowers in the dark because it was the only language of sorrow he was permitted. She pressed closer to him, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady rhythm of his heart, and she made a decision. Not with her mind, which was afraid, but with her wolf, which was certain. With the bond, which was singing between them like a struck bell. Then she closed her eyes and let herself fall. The fog was waiting. Thick and gray and malevolent, pressing against her skin with the intimate hostility of something that knew her name. The skeletal trees stretched overhead, their bare branches interlocking like the bars of a cage, and the silence was so complete it had a sound, a low subsonic hum that vibrated in Jessamy's teeth. But this time she wasn't afraid. This time she walked forward with purpose, following the bond like a thread of gold through the gray, until she found them. Torvald's wolf was worse than before. The great silver beast lay on its side in the fog, the dark tendrils wrapped so tightly around its body that its breathing was shallow and labored. Its eyes, gray as its master's, tracked Jessamy's approach with a desperation that made something fracture behind her ribs. And beside it, crouched in the fog, was a smaller shape. Jessamy's heart stopped. A wolf pup. Small, dark-furred, with brown eyes. That Jessamy would have known anywhere in any world in any form. "Avin," she breathed. The pup lifted its head and whimpered. The sound. Gods! The sound! It was the same whimper she had heard through the locked door. The sound she had told herself was nothing, and it shattered something inside her so completely that she felt the pieces fall. The tendrils binding the king's wolf were wrapped around the pup, too. The same curse, the same cage, connecting them in shared imprisonment. Vedmar's spell had chained them together, king and child, so that neither could break free without the other. A figure materialized from the fog. Not Vedmara herself, but the curse's avatar, its keeper, its voice. It wore the face of the old woman from the vision, bone-thin and white-eyed, but it spoke with 1,000 voices. The voices of the dead from the Greymark, the voices of Jessamy's own grief. "He killed my son," the figure said, and the fog pressed closer. "He burned our homes. He took everything. So I took everything from him, his wolf, her child, your peace. Fair exchange." Jessamy looked at the figure and felt the pull of its logic, the seductive gravity of justified vengeance. Garrick's people had suffered, innocents had died on both sides. The grief was real, and the anger behind the curse was real, and part of Jessamy, the part that had spent 3 years whispering Avin's name to an empty tree, understood it completely. But understanding is not agreement, and grief is not justice. "You took a 2-year-old child," Jessamy said, her voice steady, despite the tears on her face. "You cursed a girl who had nothing to do with your war. Whatever Garrick suffered, whatever your people lost, this is not balance. This is cruelty, wearing the mask of fairness." The figure flickered. "You lost a son," Jessamy continued, stepping closer. "I lost a daughter. For 3 years I knelt at a tree and spoke to a ghost because I thought my child was dead. I know what your grief feels like. I have lived inside it. And I am telling you that it doesn't get better by making others live inside it too." The fog churned, the tendrils around the wolves tightened, and the king's wolf let out a sound of pain that vibrated through the bond and nearly brought Jessamy to her knees. She didn't stop. She walked to the pup and knelt down. The dark tendrils hissed at her touch, burning her hands, but she didn't pull back. She gathered the small wolf against her chest, and the contact was agony and ecstasy. Fire and water, the worst pain and the deepest relief of her entire life. She could feel her daughter's heartbeat against her own. Small and fast and alive. 3 years of whispering to an empty tree, and her daughter's heart had been beating the entire time. 3 years of thinking she was alone in her grief, and Avin had been right here, trapped and waiting and alive. The pup pressed its nose against Jessamy's neck, and a small whimper escaped its throat that contained more recognition than any word could carry. "I forgive you," Jessamy whispered to the figure. "Not because what you did was forgivable, but because holding on to this is killing my daughter and the man I love, and I choose them. I will always choose them." She turned to Torvald's wolf, still chained, still struggling. "And you need to forgive yourself," she said, and now she was speaking to the man as much as the beast. "You fought a war you didn't want because the alternative was worse. You saved my child from a fire at the cost of your own freedom. You carried a secret for 3 years to protect a little girl you had no obligation to protect. That is not guilt, that is love, and you are allowed to put the weight down." Through the bond, she felt Torvald's presence surge forward. Not the king, not the controlled and guarded man who built walls around his suffering, but the wolf beneath, the one that had been fighting to break free for 3 years. She felt it hear her, felt it recognize the truth in her words, felt the moment it chose to stop agreeing with its own destruction. The tendrils cracked. The sound was enormous, a splintering, crystalline shatter that echoed through the fog like breaking ice on a frozen lake. The dark vines around the king's wolf fractured and fell away, dissolving into ash. The wolf surged to its feet, silver and massive and blazing with a light that drove the fog backward. The tendrils around the pup in Jessamy's arms withered and crumbled, and the small wolf yelped and pressed closer against her chest. The avatar of the curse opened its mouth, but no sound came out. The grief that had built the cage, the fury that had given it teeth, the vengeance that had kept it fed for 3 years, all of it was dissolving, because the fuel had been cut off at the source. Jessamy's grief had transformed, not into joy, not into forgetting, but into something stronger than either: acceptance, the willingness to carry the scar without letting it become a chain. The fog was retreating, pulling back like a tide, and the skeletal trees were dissolving, their branches crumbling into the thinning gray. The figure flickered once, twice, and then she was gone. The silver wolf threw back its head and howled. The sound shook the dissolving world from edge to edge, triumphant and primal and free. The pup in Jessamy's arms answered with a high, thin cry of her own, and the two voices braided together in the clearing air. The fog lifted, the silence broke, and somewhere above them, impossibly, light poured in. Jessamy woke, gasping in the dark of the king's chambers, her arms wrapped around empty air, the phantom weight of a small wolf still warm against her chest. Torvald was awake beside her, sitting up, breathing hard. His eyes were wide and clear and brilliant, and there was a light in them she had never seen before. "It's gone," he said, his voice cracking with disbelief. "The cage. It's gone. I can feel her. I can feel my wolf." His hand found hers in the dark, and when his fingers closed around hers, Jessamy felt the bond between them flare with a completeness that stole her breath. "Whole, undamaged, free, Avon," Jessamy said. "Take me to her now." The corridor was dark and quiet. Their footsteps echoed off the stone walls. As Torvald led her toward the locked door she had passed so many times, the door she had heard a small sound behind and told herself it was nothing. The guard stepped aside without a word. Torvald's hand was trembling as he reached for the iron handle, and Jessamy realized with a jolt that he was afraid. Afraid of what she would find inside. Afraid of her judgment, her anger, the reckoning that 3 years of secrecy demanded. She took his hand and squeezed. He looked at her, searching her face for absolution. He wasn't sure he deserved. "Open it," she said softly. The door swung inward. The room behind it was small and warm, lit by a low fire, and dozens of candles that filled the space with soft golden light. It was furnished with the careful attention of someone who had tried to make a cage feel like a home. A thick rug covered the stone floor. Shelves lined the walls, filled with children's things, wooden toys, picture books, a collection of smooth river stones arranged in careful rows. A small bed sat in the corner, covered in quilts that someone had chosen with thought. Soft colors, gentle patterns, the kind of fabrics you wrapped around something precious. On the bedside table, a wooden bowl held a collection of dried wildflowers. Blue mountain columbine, dozens of them, saved and dried and kept. The ones he hadn't taken to the tree. The ones he had kept here for her, so that the room where her daughter lived would hold the same flowers that adorned her memorial. Jessamy pressed her hand over her mouth. The care in this room was everywhere. In the worn spot on the rug, where someone had sat for hours. In the books, whose spines were cracked from reading aloud. In the small scratches on the door frame where tiny claws had marked the wood. This wasn't a prison where a cursed child had been stored and forgotten. This was a room where a king had spent 3 years trying to be enough for a little girl who wasn't his. And on the rug, in the center of the room, Curled in a tight ball of dark fur was a wolf pup. Jessamie's legs gave out. She sank to her knees in the doorway, and the sound that left her throat was beyond words, beyond language, a raw and primal cry that carried 3 years of emptiness and longing and desperate ferocious hope. The pup's head lifted, brown eyes, enormous and bright, fixed on Jessamie's face. The small ears swiveled forward, a tentative nose twitched, scenting the air, and then something shifted in those brown eyes. Recognition. Not learned, not logical, but bone-deep and ancient, and absolute. The recognition of a child who knows its mother's scent the way the earth knows rain. And then the pup moved. She uncurled from her ball and padded toward Jessamie on unsteady legs. And with every step, the dark fur rippled and shifted. Paws stretched into fingers, the small body lengthened and straightened. Fur became skin, smooth and warm and real. And by the time she reached Jessamie's arms, it was not a wolf standing before her, but a child, a girl. 5 years old, with dark tangled curls and wide brown eyes, and a face that was so achingly, ruinously familiar that Jessamie couldn't see through her tears. "Mama," Evan whispered. The word demolished everything. Every wall, every defense, every scar Jessamie had built around the wound of losing her. She pulled her daughter into her arms and held on with a ferocity that came from the deepest, most ancient part of her, the part that had never stopped reaching, never stopped searching, never stopped listening for a voice she had been told she would never hear again. Avon clung to her neck with small fingers that remembered how to hold on. She was shaking, trembling with the effort of her first shift in 3 years, and she smelled of wood smoke and wool and something sweet that was entirely, unmistakably her own. The same scent. 3 years and the same scent. And Jessamie buried her face in her daughter's hair and breathed her in and let the grief break apart and wash away. "I'm here," Jessamie whispered into her daughter's curls. "I'm here, I've got you. I'm never letting go again." She didn't know how long she knelt there, rocking Avon against her chest, feeling the small heartbeat hammering against her own. Time dissolved. The world narrowed to the weight of her child in her arms. The impossible, miraculous weight of a daughter returned from the dead. Behind them, in the doorway, Torvald stood motionless. His hands were clenched at his sides, his face wet, and the expression he wore was one of a man watching something sacred and knowing he had no right to be part of it. Jessamie looked up at him over Evan's shoulder. Their eyes met. She held out her hand. The king crossed the room in 3 strides, dropped to his knees beside them, and Jessamie pulled him in. The 3 of them held each other on the candlelit floor, the bond humming warm and steady between 2 of them, and something gentler, something new and fragile and full of promise, reaching toward the 3rd. Avon's small hand found the pocket of Jessamie's robe and closed around the carved wolf inside it. She pulled it out and held it up, studying it with wide, serious eyes. Her thumb traced the rough carved ears, the same gesture Torvald had made when he picked it up from the rug all those nights ago. "Mine," Avon said softly. "My wolf." Jessamie laughed through her tears, a broken, beautiful sound. "Yes, sweetheart, your wolf. It's been waiting for you." Avon tucked the carving against her chest, pressed her face into Jessamie's neck and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep. The first peaceful human sleep she had known in 3 years. Torvald's arm tightened around them both. Jessamie leaned into him, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, and let herself rest. Recovery came in small, uneven steps that sometimes felt like no progress at all. Avon didn't speak much in those first weeks. She clung to Jessamie with a fierceness that made simple tasks like bathing and dressing into negotiations, and she woke screaming in the night from dreams she couldn't yet describe. But she was alive and human and growing, and every morning, Jessamy watched her daughter eat breakfast with clumsy, determined fingers and felt the same staggering disbelief that she had felt in the candlelit room. Torvald's wolf returned to him fully over the following month, each shift stronger and smoother than the last. The first time he transformed in front of the court, the collective exhale was almost audible. The whispers about his deterioration had been circulating for longer than Fenwick had realized, and the sight of the massive silver wolf standing whole and vital in the great hall silenced them all. The whispers about Jessamy were harder to silence. A foundling herbalist, as the Alpha King's mate, was not what the court had envisioned, and the addition of a previously unknown child complicated things further. But Torvald handled the politics with the same immovable resolve he brought to everything. And when a minor lord made the mistake of questioning the match publicly, the king's response was brief and final. "She walked into a curse that was killing me and broke it with her bare hands," Torvald said. "If you have concerns about her qualifications, I invite you to take them up with her directly." Nobody did. On a morning in late spring, Jessamy walked to the hollow tree with Avon on her hip and Torvald beside her. Whisper Grove was blooming, the overgrown path softened by new growth, the skeletal branches now thick with leaves that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns on the forest floor. Avon wriggled down from Jessamy's arms and walked the ancient oak, on legs still finding their certainty. She peered into the hollow, reached inside with one small hand, and placed a blue wildflower on the bed of moss, where the carved wolf had rested for 3 years. The keepsake was in Avon's pocket now, where it belonged. Jessamy watched her daughter pat the flower into place with careful fingers, and Torvald's hand found hers. She leaned into his shoulder. He pressed his lips against her temple. And for the first time in 3 years, the hollow tree held something other than grief.